सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Staying with the Middle East situation or the situation around Israel, we are today expanding the area of our gaze. We are gazing beyond the immediate area where fighting is taking place, or Israel or next door neighbors of Israel. We are looking at slightly wider Middle East, because there is always, just as people say, a lot of the people say, apologists for Hamas also, unfortunately, who would say that, look, there are root causes to this, right? There are root causes, Palestinian cause. But at the same time, there is a root cause also for the larger motivations of the bigger powers that are involved here. Because this is one more of these proxy wars that continue to be fought in the Middle East. And in this case, it isn't so much two superpowers fighting. It's not as if the Americans and the Chinese are fighting, or the Americans and the Russians are fighting a proxy war. This is a case of middling powers. That is Saudi Arabia and Iran fighting a proxy war. In this case, what's happening in Israel right now, Iranians are fighting it more than Saudi Arabia, although the Saudi Arabians have made some moves which have thrown the Iranians off balance. So we look at some of those situations today with some scholarly writing that I'll be referring to, and also start with a very important conclusion. Not end with a conclusion, start with a very important conclusion that in personal relations, in professional relations, and even in strategic policy making, it is the negative emotions that have much greater push then positive emotions might have the pull. Or let me just say that who's your enemy tends to determine your policy much more than who's your friend. So nations, like human beings do in their responses, nations also tailor their policies to fit who their enemies are. So they target their enemies much more than working with their friends. And that's how nations also work more towards fixing their enemies or teaching their enemies a lesson than building friendships or alliances. So that is the lesson, or that is the conclusion that we start today's episode of Cut The Clutter with. Now, as we go along, there are a few references I'll give you, and I'll be sharing these links with you with the description of this episode, and you can read those. I'm only listing 4 of these. I could have listed 40 of these, but I'm not trying to impress you, nor am I a research scholar who thinks that if I really pad up my paper with 400 references, maybe my guide or supervisor will get impressed and think that, oh, this guy has really done a lot of hard work. Not that. I'm just giving you 4 references. There can be 500 things to read these days every day, because this is the most written about topic, not just in global media, but also in the think tank community. And there are lots of scholars. Middle East scholarship is so wide. I suppose that's why nobody's been able to find a solution to the problem. But 4 pieces of writing from which I have drawn several of the insights that I'm going to share with you today. So these 4 articles are, so the first article is from Foreign Affairs magazine. It's headlined, "The End of America's Exit Strategy in the Middle East. Hamas's assault and Iran's role in it lays bare Washington's illusions." This is written by Suzanne Maloney, who is Vice President at Brookings Institution and also Director of Brookings Institution's Foreign Policy Division. That's the first article. The second is from Foreign Policy magazine. That is, "The Hamas Attack Has Changed Everything" by Stephen Cook, who is a Middle East fellow at Council on Foreign Relations. Third is a story from the New York Times. It's a detailed story with multiple bylines from June 17, 2023. And we are leaning back on it because that story gives us an insight into where today's trouble might have started. And this story is written by Mark Mazzetti, who is the New York Times' correspondent, has written a fine book, The Way of the Knife, on how CIA became a killing machine instead of just being an intelligence organization. Ronan Bergman, Edward Wong, and Vivian Nerine. So this is a detailed story from the New York Times from June. And finally, there's a Twitter thread. This is a Twitter thread from Ali Amjad Rizvi. Ali Amjad Rizvi is a Pakistani Canadian author, self-proclaimed atheist. He's author of a book called The Atheist Muslim. His Twitter thread actually gives us very brave and very sharp insights, and I'll be leaning on those also. I'm sharing all of these with you, so please go ahead and read the original as well. Now, what exactly is the New York Times story of June telling us? So this New York Times story of June 17, 2023, it is talking about, it's giving us a lot of inside dope on how America at the topmost level was reaching out to Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia and trying to bring about a rapprochement between Israel and Saudi Arabia, or say between Saudi Arabia and Israel, because stories reported from the things that happened in Saudi Arabia first. So we know that 2020, 3 years ago, in Trump's last days, Trump administration was able to secure what was called the Abraham Accords. That is what brought Bahrain, UAE and Israel together. They established normal diplomatic relations. They've had tourists going to each other's countries. They've opened embassies in each other's countries. The effort at that time also was to bring in Saudi Arabia, because in the Muslim world, particularly in the Sunni Muslim world, in the Arab world, also in that part of the Middle East, Saudi Arabia is the most important country, also because the holiest places of the Muslim faith are located in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia at that point has balked. They had not joined this alliance, the Abraham Accords, but at the same time, Saudi Arabia was flirting with Israel. But a lot was happening also behind the scenes, like that famous meeting in the new Neom city that the Saudi royal family is building. In fact, we had discussed that in an entire episode of Cut The Clutter, of which I will share a link with you. Now, this story tells us that Saudi demands seem to be quite steep. So Saudi demands essentially were three. Number one, strengthen Saudi Arabia's security alongside American guarantees in case it gets attacked. We know that Saudis have very modern weapons, a very modern army, but they are not pretty good. They are not particularly good at defending themselves. And their army is not particularly good at fighting. That we have seen also in what's happening in Yemen. Also, we've seen what happens when Houthis, a very primitive group, has been firing missiles at them. So Saudis need foreign help. Saudis need the American umbrella. So first thing, American security guarantees should be strengthened with a clear American guarantee to say that in case you are attacked, we'll come to your defense. That's a bit like NATO. Number two, access to more American weapons. So anytime Americans are selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, there are issues at Congress, etc. So they want access to more American weapons. And third, and the most important, US consent to enrich uranium for civil nuclear purposes. Now you might say, Saudi Arabia has so much oil, right? Why do they need nuclear energy? Why do they need to enrich uranium for civil nuclear purposes? But Saudis would turn around and say, in which case, Iran has so much oil, why are the Iranians doing it? So Iranians are doing it to build weapons-grade uranium. Whether they build weapons or not, but once you have a stockpile of weapons-grade uranium, you can do what you want. It just takes, if you remember that famous or infamous line used in the case of Pakistan, one turn of the screwdriver, right? Saudis also want their own uranium enrichment capability, for which they want American clearances and also, who knows, American cooperation. Ultimately, they may say 100 times that this is only for peaceful civilian purposes, but nobody will buy that. Everybody will see that as a counter to Iranians enriching their uranium. And you know what? Israelis also see it like that. So they also feel insecure about it, because they don't want a nuclear race now beginning in the Middle East. The fourth demand that they had was some massive concessions to Palestinians, because Palestinians are a big emotional issue in Saudi Arabia. So give them something, even if you don't give them full statehood. That looks like, as negotiations went on, the Saudis upped the ask on that one and said, look, we can only normalize formally with Israel if a full-fledged Palestinian state is established. An independent, full-fledged Palestinian state is established. Now, in each one of these demands, somebody would have liked to exercise a veto. Now, Israel, for example, would have liked to exercise a veto with the uranium enrichment issue, but also with the Palestinian statehood, because Netanyahu's government now is very conservative, very right-wing, very populist in a very conservative religious sense. So they hark back to old scriptures and they say two-state solution is absolutely not possible. Now, most of the rest of the world is committed to a two-state solution, including India, including the Modi government. But Netanyahu has been pushing it in another direction. So how does he then accept the Saudi demand for Palestinian statehood? Similarly, Saudi Arabia would not accept peace with Israel without a Palestinian state, because what do they do with their own public opinion? You might think that they are a dictatorship, but they also have a public opinion. And I will just come to that in a minute. And even Biden has an issue, because he's been very critical of Mohammed bin Salman, of this Saudi administration or this Saudi regime, particularly because of columnist Khashoggi's assassination in Turkey. So he's also had to do a lot of internal correction and internal sort of repairing of his own image at home, because he had raised this to such levels. And now for him to be reaching out to Mohammed bin Salman looks like a cop-out, which it actually is. So it was in this process that these talks were going on. This was a complicated thing. I see a line in the story that says, in the Middle East, it takes 3 to tango, right? The usual thing is it takes 2 to tango, but in the Middle East, the story says it takes 3 to tango. 3 in this case would be Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the US. But you know what? There is a fourth power, that's Iran. They come in. Iran comes in, then sort of indirectly in their informal alliance now, or at least informal convergence of strategic interests. Russia and China also come in. So what happens? If it takes 3 to tango, if the fourth comes in, fifth comes in, sixth comes in, then what does it become? It's not a tango anymore. It's like a wild bhangra at some wedding party, or maybe a holy party. That is completely unruly. And then from that situation, nothing can progress. In spite of that, progress was being made. All sides had an interest in this working out. The Saudis wanted American guarantees, nuclear enrichment, and they also wanted to be able to tell their people, see, we got the Palestinians freedom. And they also wanted a formal partnership with Israel, because remember what I said to you earlier, that your strategic responses are often determined not by who's your friend, but by who's your enemy. So the enemy in this case is Iran. Enemy for Israel also is Iran. So enemy's enemy, I might have 100 problems with that guy, but I will go and make friends with him, or have at least a transactional alliance with him. That is what the Saudis saw in it. For Netanyahu, all the ratings, all the opinion polls are now showing, at least before this Hamas attack, all the opinion polls have been showing that if there is a fresh election, he will lose. And Israel has fresh elections all the time. He has to shore up his image, and one way of doing that was to normalize relationship with Saudi Arabia. That, look, I have now made Israel legitimate in the entire Arab world. That would have given him tailwinds for his own politics. And finally, Biden. Next year is the election year in America. He was slow to move in the Middle East, but now that he has moved, if an Israel-Saudi Arabia pact came, another edition of the Abraham Accords came in between Saudi Arabia and Israel, that would be a big thing to talk about for Biden in his election campaign. So everybody had reasons to move in this direction. It was moving in that direction. I told you about public opinion in Saudi Arabia. So Washington Institute conducted a poll in April 2023 in Saudi Arabia, which showed that 78% Saudis thought that Abraham Accords had a very negative impact on the region, on the Middle East. So the Saudi clergy also has to deal with that public opinion. They can't go and normalize with Israel until Israelis do something really big for the Palestinians. It is in this situation that Hamas walks in. And what is Hamas but a front for the Iranians? Because Iranians didn't like it. Iranians thought if this happens, then a large chunk of the Sunni Muslim world, the entire Arab world, in fact, almost the entire Arab world, comes together with Israel in rivalry with us. So what can we do to scuttle it? Now, there is no clear evidence that this is how it happened, but in diplomacy, in geopolitics, you have to draw your own conclusions. And this looks quite logical. Now, what does Suzanne Belloni mean when she says this is the end of America's exit strategy? So she says that for more than 20 years, America has been fighting, quote unquote, terrorists in the Middle East. This started after 9/11, which happened in 2001. Now, you kept on fighting. That depleted America's strength. Also, there were failed experiments at creating, at nation building in Iraq and Afghanistan. Afghanistan was much worse than Iraq. In Iraq, some kind of democracy did come into being. Not maybe did not put in power exactly the people the Americans would have wanted, but that's how democracies are. Iraq still got something. Afghanistan was a complete disaster. Iraq also was almost a disaster and consumed a lot of American resources, lives, and also turned public opinion against any activism overseas. Now she says what's happened is America would have thought that there are bigger problems and bigger challenges in the world. There are Russians in Ukraine. There's a Russia-China axis. There's also a kind of Russia-China-Iran axis. At this point, the last thing America needed was a Middle Eastern distraction. But now that this distraction has come, Americans have no option but to stay put in the Middle East and get even more involved at a time when it might have suited them to go away from this and turn their attention more towards China and Ukraine. In fact, China, Taiwan, Ukraine, those are America's larger strategic interests. And what this turn in the Middle East has done, and that's why she said Hamas's assault and Iranian role in it lays bare Washington's illusions. So illusion was now that Middle East looked to be stabilizing. There was going to be another settlement between Saudi Arabia and Israel. This will become a more stable place. So I can then go and turn my attention fully to Indo-Pacific, fully to China, Taiwan, Ukraine, etc. She said now that has changed. America now is drawn in even more deeply into the Middle East, which is something that suits Russia and Ukraine, Iran in the Middle East, and China in Taiwan. And this in spite of the fact that neither Russians nor Iranians nor the Chinese have any boots on the ground. In fact, they've invested nothing except give low-tech weapons and some money to Hamas, which actually is not such a big investment, and that is what the Iranians have done. But that has now trapped America deeper in the Middle East instead of being able to go away. And then she goes on to say that the big American illusion came from the idea that you could give little favors to Iran. For example, Americans got their hostages released, in return for which they unfroze $6 billion of Iranian oil revenues, which had been trapped because of the sanctions. These 6 billion were given back to the Iranians, and she says the American illusion was that these little favors will please the Iranians and get better conduct from them. That is not happening. And she quotes from Khamenei, the Iranian supreme leader, said days before the Hamas attacks, and I quote, "The firm view of the Islamic Republic is that the governments that are gambling or normalizing relations with the Zionist regime will suffer losses, defeat awaits them, they are making a mistake." Now, did he have a premonition? He's a holy man, he might have had a premonition, but more likely he had knowledge beforehand, although nobody is saying that with any evidence right now. But the only gainer in what has happened within the region is Iran, because they have scuttled this three-way tango that was taking place between Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the US. And she also concludes that, look, with the Iranians, the basic thing hasn't changed. And then she goes on to say, look, whatever calculations you might make, the foundational principle of Iranian regime has not changed. And what is that foundational principle? It is a determination to upend the regional order by any means necessary. The regional order, which is drawn from American power through the Saudis, through UAE, and in a way also through alliances like I2U2. I2U2, as we know, is India, Israel, UAE, and the US. Because Americans have been building new alliances in the Middle East, and that is something that really upsets the Iranians and throws them off balance. And they've decided to do something about it. And what they're telling the Americans is that if you can use other people, other nationalities, other communities to fight your battles away from your shores, we can also do that. And that is what's happening with Hamas. That is what keeps happening with Hezbollah, because Iranians have strength there. And some of that has been playing out in Syria as well. And that said, I come to my fourth reference. That is Ali Amjad Rizvi, the Pakistani-Canadian author of the book called The Atheist Muslim. He says, first of all, you can either be pro-Palestinian or pro-Hamas. You can't be both. Now, a lot of people in India are also confused when they are talking about Hamas attacks. They say, no, Hamas ne to kiya hai, lekin Palestinians ka bhi ek grievance hai. Palestinians also have a grievance. So he says, you can't be pro-Palestinian and pro-Hamas at the same time. Why does he say so? Because Hamas, he says, is more loyal to Iranian clergy than interested in betterment of the Palestinians' fate. And he says Hamas is a despicable group which throws rockets, which fires rockets from its own hospitals and schools, so the Israelis would bomb them and they will then use bodies of babies and women killed in those bombings to get sympathy from the world. They are not bothered about the Palestinians, so please don't confuse Hamas's cause with the Palestinian cause. Now your immediate reaction could be, oh, this guy is obviously pro-Israel. It's not that simple, because he says that just as Hamas is no friend of Palestinians, all these tweets will run on your screen as I talk. He says just as Hamas is no friend of Palestinians, Netanyahu is no friend of Israel. So that should settle the doubt in your mind on whether he's an apologist for Israel. He's not an apologist for Israel, at least definitely not for Netanyahu's policies in Israel. He says Netanyahu has weakened Israel in three ways. Number one, he has gone after a single state solution, so not a two-state solution. In the process, he's caused a real problem. And what is the problem? And that's a dilemma that I first read about in 1983 when John Le Carre wrote his The Little Drummer Girl. Now, Little Drummer Girl, the plot is that Mossad goes and recruits a 26-year-old British left radical artist with the intention that she'll be smuggled into the Palestinian camps. She'll become a human bomber, and through her they will reach Palestinian underground's leadership. Her case officer is a Mossad officer called Joseph. Now Joseph in that book has a dilemma. While Joseph is doing his job, he's the case officer for Charlie, their key asset. At the same time, he thinks that, look, what happens if we keep these territories occupied and annex them into Israel? If we annex them into Israel, Israel will become an Arab majority country. If it's an Arab majority country and everybody has a vote, if it's an Arab majority democracy and everybody has a vote, right, then it can't remain a Zionist country, because then Arabs will be more than Jews, and who knows, you might get a government where Arabs will have more seats in the Knesset. So what is the solution? Is the solution then to annex these territories and deny the right of vote to the Arabs? In which case, Israel can stay a Zionist country, but it cannot be a democracy. So if you want to annex all these territories, West Bank, etc., and say all these Arabs who are living here are part of Israel, then you can either be a Zionist country or you can be a democracy. You can't be both. And that's the point Ali Amjad Rizvi is also making, that by pursuing this one state idea, which is a very conservative, right-wing, religiously driven idea, Netanyahu has created a real problem in Israel. And second thing he has done is to damage Israel's interests is that he split the American Republicans and Democrats. Usually in America, there was total bipartisan support for the Israeli cause. But he split the Republicans and Democrats, which has now caused a problem in America, because most American Jews, the large majority of American Jews, all polls tell us, vote for Democratic Party. So that has also brought about a break between American Jewish community and the Israeli Jews. Then he says that his dictatorial power grab in trying to destroy his judiciary, etc., has weakened his system. And the intelligence failure is not unconnected with that. Because when you get so many institutions broken, when you get so many people disillusioned, so many in your security elites have been protesting, that has an effect. That has an impact on your capability. And finally, he says that, look, Netanyahu is coming as much from the scriptures, and he says refer to Exodus 23, 31, 32 or Deuteronomy 1.8. These are old Jewish texts. If you read these among others, These explain to you where his finding is completely irrational justification for a one-state formula that is giving the Palestinians nothing. Similarly, if you want to say where Hamas is coming from, then check out Surah 551, 59, 60 or Hamas's charter of 1988 and 2017 where Hamas basically says that Israel has to be destroyed, all Jews have to be killed. That's the belief because that was prophesied in the scriptures. Now these references make for fascinating reading even when I read them cursorily. So one of these days, not today because we don't have the time, one of these days we'll read this up more carefully, religious references, scriptural references, and also some commentaries to bring back to you the case of what happens when two deeply conservative, irrational religious mindsets clash. So this is between two groups who believe in the scriptures and who are religiously driven and to that extent are not fully rational. And then he goes on to conclude, don't listen to nothing to do with the religion crowd. Religion poisons everything. Religion kills, and that couldn't be clear in this case. So as we enter day 6 of this conflict now, this I thought was a good way of understanding where this conflict is coming from, the larger geopolitics and clash of strategic interests involved in the region. We haven't gone beyond the region as yet. In the region and also clash of two extreme religiosities. So once again, I also buy this argument that Hamas does not represent the Palestinian interest. Because remember, the Palestinian Authority, PLO, have recognized Israel as a state. They have accepted long back. They have accepted Israel's right to exist. Hamas does not accept Israel's right to exist. At the same time, or maybe you want to say on the other hand, it is the Netanyahu administration and his politics who don't accept the idea of a Palestinian state. In which case, commitments made in the past to the Palestinian Authority in return for their recognition of Israel now do not stand. So it is this mix of clashing religious irrationality and also political dishonesty that has created this deadly cocktail. And as I say this, remember, cocktails don't always have to be alcoholic. Cocktails can also be explosive, which is what you have right now in Israel.